Thank you so much, Anna. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's great to have you back at Parsons, especially in this role. It seems to me as if calling you a fashion designer almost sells you short, because you do so much more than design individual pieces of clothing. You make things that define worlds unto themselves, that have narratives. You're a storyteller as much as a designer. So let me ask you first, is this observation correct? And if so, how did you come to connect fashion to storytelling?
Well, I think the key is that if I'm going to do a show, it has to be a show, and you have to transport your audience. And that's always the challenge. It's like, where am I going to take them? What story am I going to tell them? And what are they going to gain from spending that 12 minutes with me? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So those are the things that I think about from the very beginning when I start thinking about a collection. What's the theme going to be? What's the inspiration going to be? And the music, the backdrop, and the casting. So all those things, it's almost like making a mini movie.
Sure, sure. But beyond the actual show where you present the work, it always seems to me as if even if one looks at a single piece of your clothing, it feels like there's a story embedded in it somehow.
Well, I really build the collection on my inspiration wall. And it usually starts out every season with images that I'm being obsessed about. And I'll kind of shuffle them around. Then I start doing my intense research if I land on a topic. And sometimes I don't have that topic right in the beginning. Right. So I just start looking at things that I like, collecting pictures, collecting ideas. And then just, it's almost like putting together a puzzle, putting images together, playing with them. And once I start coming up with a theme, I start arranging everything by color, research more, but within that color story. Okay. And then I build the whole collection really on my inspiration wall.
Wow, and your inspiration wall is not just pictures of fashion, right? I mean,
no,
in fact,
rarely,
if anything, it's
yeah.
rarely that. You always struck me as one designer who really is seeking inspiration from the rest of culture and the rest of the world and trying to connect all these things. Is that fair?
Well, I think I have the best job in the world because I can use anything I'm obsessed about, anything that I want to learn more about, anything that I enjoy reading about or watching, and I can use that and put it into my work. And it happens when I'm working on a collection. I might start out with a theme, but at one time I was working on a theme inspired by Marie Antoinette because my friend Sofia Coppola was working on the film, and I thought, oh, this is going to be a trend fashion-wise. But then I went on a trip with my two nephews, Grant and Jackson, to Turkey and Greece, where they were studying the Iliad in school, and they wanted to do that journey.
Right.
While we were in Turkey, we went to visit the Naval Museum, and there was a big exhibition on Barbarossa the pirate. So then I started thinking, oh, pirate, oh, black and white stripes, you know, headbands, all these things. Oh, kind of like the New York Dolls. And then I was thinking about the New York Dolls, which were my favorite band when I first came to New York. So I kind of mixed that all together along with Marie Antoinette, and that's what became the collection. And the picture that's on the cover of my book is that dress that's kind of an embodiment of all those ideas put together.
And do you like the fact that they're not ideas that most people would put together? I mean, is the idea almost a deliberate culture clash, so to speak?
It's just the way my brain works. It's the way it's wired that way. And then I think it just creates a different perspective on many different things by combining them and kind of taking it to a different level.
Right, right. And do you seek to bring them into some kind of synthesis, or is the idea almost that it appears more like a kind of bouillabaisse or a stew of different elements?
I don't think so. I think that it still has to have a cohesiveness to tell the story of what the season is, and that's what I keep relying on my board about, is that I keep looking back at it. Or my brain will go in a million different directions, and then you can't pull it back together. Right, so this way, I keep looking back and seeing what it was that initially inspired me, what it is that I'm loving about these images, and what is the story that I'm trying to tell my audience.
Right, right, right. I mean, you know, it fascinates me because so many fashion designers, even some of the greatest of them, are not interested in inspiration from the world outside of fashion. And you sort of almost start with that world and then turn it into fashion somehow.
Oh, to me, I think fashion is really a mirror of what's going on. And when you look at, like, let's say, period movies, you see that. Because, like, you've seen period movies, like, let's say, a Victorian movie like Vanity Fair, but it was shot in the 30s. You see both the 30s and the Victorian at the same time. So,
yes,
you know, it's just, you can't help it. Even though they're trying to do Victorian, there's still that 30s thing. So there's always a reflection of what the actual style is.
You can never fully escape your own time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow. No, that's absolutely fascinating. And to be, you know, as committed to the rest of the world, though, I think is so wonderful, as opposed to just a kind of self-referential way of looking at fashion.
But again, I feel that fashion is that reflection, and it's influenced by what's going on in the world. You know, they used to say that, you know, hemlines went up when the economy was good and hemlines went down.
Right.
So, I mean, I don't think that's true anymore, but, you know, there were things like that that influenced. And so as much as you try to think that you're the star of your own show, it's not really the case. you're really influenced by what's going on around you and what the timing is and and if it's your moment or not. You know, all those things you don't have control over.
Well, merely recognizing that is, I think, important in itself. And somehow what you're saying seems consistent with another observation that we hear a lot today, which is that influence in fashion today comes more sort of from the streets upward than from some dictate from a fashion mafia downward, you know. And it seems like your whole way of operating takes that into account and embraces it.
I think it's because it's what I'm interested in. That those are the first clues, like what you're seeing on the street. When you travel or when you're in your own hometown, suddenly you start seeing every cool-looking girl has on athletic socks, and you think, okay, I'm going to do my fashion version of that. Or, you know, everyone's wearing a fuller skirt, and then you start you know, playing with that. It's usually what happens is the furthest thing from what you're used to attracts your eye, and then you kind of bring that into the fold.
Because it's a surprise. Because it's
and unexpected. And you have, like, fashion is a pendulum. It, like, really swings a completely different way. And that's what attracts me, is that, like, that different look, that newness. And then I try to bring it into my concept.
Do you spend a lot of time just looking around? I mean, like when you're in New York, for example, do you spend time just walking up and down the streets trying to drink it in?
I enjoy that. Yeah, I enjoy that. And I like going to things other than fashion events, just to see what's going on in the world. But you just never know. You know, I could be at the bank and get an inspiration. So you just never know. Dwayne Reed, you know, you don't know. That's
the best thing anyone's ever said about Dwayne Reed. I could see a new Dwayne Reed advertising campaign. You know, Anna Sui, get your ideas here. Right, okay. No, but I get your point, that you never know where inspiration will be found. And also, sometimes things just kind of seep into your brain and then they percolate upward and it pops out again in some other way.
Well, you just hope that you get that, like, divine intervention that makes sense, that you can build a collection around it. And sometimes it's a series of things, or things that don't seem related, but you kind of, like, make notes of it, or keep it in the back of your mind, and then you bring it back again and figure out how to insert it into what you're doing.
Do you feel, since you want your collections to somehow connect to what's out in the world, that they need to in some way respond, say, to politics, to the political moment that we're in? Or do you think of it more as a way of escaping from all that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think in the past, it was more that you had to be within the trend of what was going on. Because, like, you might want to do, let's say, Bozo the Clown for your collection, but if everybody else is doing very serious collections, you're going to look strange. But Nowadays, I don't know. It's kind of, the rules have kind of just like been shattered, and it's almost anything goes at this point.
Right. And yet, that makes it harder also to determine what a good collection is and what is not a good collection, right? Or,
yes and no, because I think that the critics, the buyers, they respond to whatever looks the newest.
Okay.
And I think that that's always been the case.
And how do you deal with the fact that novelty and newness in fashion comes at a faster and faster cycle today?
Oh yeah, that's what makes it so confusing.
Right.
Because
so,
it used to be a trend would start, and then there would be a few seasons, and it would peak.
Right.
And then it would go.
Right. It would have a gradual arc.
Yeah.
Sort of, yes.
Yeah. And you'd have the initiators, and then the high street stores that would start imitating, and then it would go on the decline, and you'd see it like in discount stores.
Right.
The cycle, it's so much quicker now, and everything is so immediate that, that's why people started talking about doing see now, buy now, because they thought nobody wants to wait that 6-month cycle. But I feel kind of differently. I love when you see something and you're really inspired by it. You might not even quite get it yet, but then it might take that 6 months before you can actually own it to really get the full value of it. I think that you need that longing and that desire and like really wanting something, because when everything's too immediate, it doesn't mean anything. It's so throwaway.
Right.
And you forget about it the next day.
Yeah, it's easy come, but it's also easy go.
Yeah.
Right. And it just is, right. Do you, we hear a lot about the slow food movement in a way. I mean, it seems like what you're saying almost could be calling for a slow fashion movement.
I don't think it's possible to slow it down,
right.
not the way the media is at this point.
So let me come back to the initial question. How do you cope with it then, given the challenges of running a large fashion business and stores and everything that goes along with it?
It's harder and harder because not only is the system sped up, but the system is kind of broken right now, too. There's not the infrastructure of the, there used to be a thing called buying offices.
Right.
And they would, shop for other stores, set trends, talk about trends. There used to be fashion directors at all the department stores.
Right.
And they would also predict and talk about trends. And there was a whole infrastructure that you could kind of tell what was going to happen.
They were kind of like the fashion authority almost.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
And along with it was the Garment Center, which again had its own ecosystem of producing fabrics, trims, anything you needed to make the clothing. But all of that's been so fragmented at this point. That was one of the things that happened with globalization. It just kind of, it's so fragmented that I think that that's part of the problem of the whole business right now.
Well, globalization, absolutely, you're right, but also the loss of power of the department stores and things like that, which are not authorities in the way that they were.
And the fact that there aren't any little boutiques anymore either.
Right.
Like a lot of those stores struggle to stay open too.
Yes.
So it's just that whole structure is changed.
So where do things get sold? I mean, where?
There's a lot of online business.
Right. Yes.
But I think that there's also a lot of talk that there's just too much stuff. So I think it still has to level out. It's still kind of in chaos right now.
Right. Well, that echoes the situation in so many realms of society, not just fashion, even though fashion might be a particularly intense example of it. It seems like we see that everywhere. Let me shift gears a little bit and ask you a bit about your background, which is extraordinary, beginning as the child of immigrants born in Detroit. And I've read that you were particularly struck at one point growing up by a piece in Life magazine about Mia Fontagrive's solo that you read as a young person and instantly felt inspired toward a fashion career. She's the woman who had an amazing mother, the celebrated model Lisa Fonsa-Greaves, and was the stepdaughter of Irving Penn. Can you tell us a little bit about discovering that piece and whether it truly changed your life?
Well, as a kid, I came to New York to be a flower girl at my aunt and uncle's wedding.
Okay.
But I had this idea that when I grew up, I was going to move to New York and be a fashion designer. Okay, I didn't really know what it was.
Right.
I had to figure that out. But I also had to figure out, how do you get to from Detroit to New York? So every family in America got Life magazine or Look magazine.
Right, right.
And I just loved the fashion stories in it. And there was one issue which talks about Mia Fonsa-Greaves and Vicky Teal and how they were doing costumes for Peter O'Toole's new movie, What's New, Pussycat? Ah. And they had graduated from Parsons, moved to Paris, and Elizabeth Taylor opened a boutique for them. So I thought, I found the magic key.
It's a pretty good life, yeah, right.
I have to go to Parsons.
Right. Okay.
And I remember that my babysitter had 17 magazine, and I thought she was so sophisticated because she was reading 17 magazine. But I remember in the back, there was always an ad for Parsons School of Design. So I asked her if I could see the magazine. I wrote down the address, and I wrote to Parsons, and I got the registration catalog. And from that point on, I decided I was going to gear my whole education and curriculum so that I could get to Parsons. So I started taking the art classes. You needed a 3.5 average, so I needed to really keep my grades up. You know, all those things I worked on, and I got accepted at Parsons.
And the rest is history. Right. You were very focused and determined, though, right?
Yeah, but you need to be a fashion designer. That's part of the key.
Right, right. No, absolutely. I'm struck by so many things about what you've just said. I mean, not only how focused it was, but also there's something kind of beautiful about, as a young girl, reading this and thinking, wow, and then kind of making it happen.
Well, that's kind of the reason that I tell the story, because I think having that dream really got me further than anything. Because if I logically would have asked somebody, how do I become a fashion designer, who was going to give me the answer?
Right,
and
right.
How do I get to Parsons? You know,
practice.
Yeah,
like how do you get to Carnegie Hall?
Right. But nobody from my school was applying to.
Where did you go to school?
I went to school in Michigan, in West Bloomfield.
In a public school or a
private?
Public
school.
School.
So I mean, it was not in the realm of things at that point. But I just had this focus and dream that this is what I was going to do.
No, it's absolutely, it's great. The other part of it that I love, as somebody who's spent part of his career as a journalist, is that you've mentioned 2 print magazines in the course of this conversation. Rarely does even one publication come up like that. And I think of that in context with comments you made, like in that wonderful New York Times interview today, where you talked about the Garment Center and nostalgia, and you mentioned that a moment ago as well, for the way it operated. It seems to me what ties those 2 things together is a wonderful sort of belief in materiality, in physical things, and ability to respond to them. And the world defined by both print media and the Garment Center and fabrics and textiles all being made right in the same place that you could touch and be part of. It seems like you responded to all of that and very much came out of that world.
Definitely, definitely.
Yeah. And do you feel nostalgic for it? Do you miss it?
It's different now.
Yeah.
It's different.
Yeah.
I mean, part of what was not in the story, you know, when I started my own business, I also got a freelance job in Italy because I needed to earn money to continue doing my business, building it. As I got orders, I needed more money to continue. I freelanced for about 12 years in Italy. But that was the best experience because that opened my mind and my ability up to globalization. Like suddenly there was a whole other world of resourcing. There was a whole other world of where to find trims and where to find buttons and how to get things made, embroidery, all those things. So again, I think I was just so fortunate to have that experience. And then after I did my first fashion show, suddenly all the Japanese department stores and trading companies were coming to me looking to import a New York designer to Japan. Again, that was part of the globalization. And if I wasn't able to react to that and adapt, I think I would not have achieved what I did. So all those things just happened, and within that realm that started out with just that print world and that confined garment center.
No, I understand. Did you have a backer when you started your business, or did you just sort of go for it and try to finance it through the freelance work you were doing and all that?
No, I started my business because I got fired from my job.
Ah, okay. Good.
I did a small collection of clothes.
Another case of bad fortune being good fortune.
I had two friends that were punk rockers, and they did incredible jewelry, and they sold all these rock and roll boutiques across the country. And I thought, they're so cool, I want to do that. And so they said, well, why don't you make some clothes and share the booth with us? So I did that, and thinking I was going to sell all these cool stores across country, but I ended up getting an order from Macy's and one from Bloomingdale's, which were the fashion department stores at that point. And I got also from Macy's a full-page New York Times ad. And the man whose company I worked for called me into the office and said, how come you have your own New York Times ad when you're on my payroll? And I said, I don't know, it just happened. And he said, you've got to stop. And I said, I can't, I have to ship my orders, so I got fired. So with that $300 paycheck, that's how I financed my company.
Wow, that's a great story. I must say, that's absolutely wonderful.
So, so that's why I did so much freelance for 12 years.
Well, when I hear about, a person who's done amazing things, who got his or her start by being fired from another job, the two names that jump into my head are not fashion, but Frank Lloyd Wright, who was fired from working for Louis Sullivan and went off on his own, and there we go. And Michael Bloomberg, who didn't make it at Salomon Brothers, and so he had to start another business, and there we are. So, I mean, there's an incredible history of people who achieve amazing things because they were lucky enough to be fired at the right moment, I think, actually. And,
I wish I would have known that then.
Wow, that's a whole other...
Because it was a scary moment.
Of course, no, it is. Well, let me ask you this. Is it, now that you are very successful and established, are there still scary moments?
Every day, every
Okay.
day. Because it's never been the same playing field.
Right.
Season after season, show after show. It's always different.
Right.
So the challenges are always different. And yeah, and you just have to respond. You have to react, and you have to figure out a solution.
You can never put it on autopilot, right?
No.
And you can never coast, really.
Right.
Yeah. That's the thing. When you're at a certain young age, you think kind of it's like a bike ride, and you just get over that hill, and it'll be straight. But then there's always another hill.
Yeah. When I decided to be a fashion designer, I thought I would wear beautiful clothes and go out to lunch every day.
Right. Well, you got the beautiful clothes part.
But the lunch didn't happen.
The lunch didn't happen. Exactly. Wow. Let's go back to Parsons and fashion education for a moment. What do you think fashion education should be like today, given the changing world that you've been talking about? What should students be doing? What should they pay attention to?
Well, I think that in this day and age, I think that they really have to think about working in another country. Probably learning Chinese would be helpful. I think that they have to learn how to adapt, have to learn how to be flexible. And again, you need that focus. It has to be what you want. you know, when I went to school, I think the graduating class was maybe 30, and now how many fashion design students graduate?
A lot, yeah, yeah. More than the market can necessarily easily absorb.
And what market?
Right,
because
right.
when I graduated, there was a huge market.
Right.
Like, there were millions of jobs, and there was a huge garment center.
Yes, yes.
So
yes.
that's the thing, that people have to understand, that they need to have that focus, because you're competing against everyone, every other designer in the world.
Right, right, right. What other things does a fashion education prepare you for, do you think?
Well, I think that the discipline was very important, especially, you know, when you're 18 years old and you move to New York City.
Right.
You know, there's a lot to do.
Yeah.
So you have to have that discipline of, you know, learning your craft. And I think that, again, that's so important, that although you don't have to be the best sewer or the best sketcher, you need those skills in order to carry out your craft. You
Right.
have to understand how clothes are made. You have to learn your resources. And I think that that's the other key to being a good designer, is really, really understanding your resources. When you see something, understanding how you can apply it to what you're doing.
Right. Did you read a lot as a kid, can I ask?
Fairy tales.
Fairy tales, okay. Yeah. But your interest in kind of the world beyond fashion, which is so clear, did that come through reading or through other things?
No, I mean, I felt that I didn't get a full education.
Okay.
Because it was so concentrated and just fashion design, that I think I've always been making up for that since then.
Right,
and I like learning about lots of things. I like really getting to the bottom of things and what influenced what, and where did that inspiration come from, and you know, getting to the bottom of it. I love that. And that's always like the moment that I'm looking for, is like, how did this one get inspired by this, and where did it initiate? So I like all of that.
Further to that idea, are there other fashion designers who've influenced you or who you admire particularly?
Oh yeah, I love shopping. I love clothes.
I
mean, I have lots of friends that are fashion designers.
You buy stuff other than your own?
I do.
Yeah.
I mean, my first job, I bought a Fendi fur coat. My first paycheck.
Right. all of your first paycheck.
All my first paycheck, and it lived better than I did for years, because it went in cold storage every summer, and I had a walk-up apartment with no AC. So yeah, I love other people's clothes.
Right.
Yeah.
Anyone in particular that you particularly
now
admire?
My favorites. I mean, I love what Prada does. I love what Marc Jacobs does. I think that there's a new guy at Paco Rabanne that's reviving that 60s brand that I think is doing an incredible job.
Great.
You know, there's nothing more exciting than watching the collections as they happen and seeing what the latest from London, Milan, Paris. And so we just ended last week with
Fashion Week. Yes.
So to me it's an exciting time, and then there's a lot to absorb, because there's sometimes when you see fashion and you don't quite get it, like maybe there's something interesting about it, and then maybe in a couple of weeks I'm gonna like start looking on Net-a-Porter and Matches and seeing who's gonna buy that, and you know, it's just I like having that obsession.
Sure. And it seems like, you know, for all we hear about fashion being kind of cutthroat, it's also a community, and it seems like for you particularly, it's been a mutually supportive community more than a competitive one. Is that fair, or am I making it seem too nice by saying that?
Depends who you're talking about.
Okay. No, I mean, I'm talking about your experience with, yeah.
It depends who you're talking about.
Okay. Fair enough. Okay. We will leave it at that. And let's go back a moment to your early years here in the 70s, which was such an amazing decade. It was a difficult time in some ways, and it's sometimes disparaged as being the decade when New York was a big mess, and garbage strikes and garbage all over, and crime and dirt and mess and graffiti and so forth. But there was a whole other side of it that was kind of magical,
Yeah.
right? And your whole career was about doors that opened in those days very, very easily. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Like, I'm the generation that came to New York to meet Andy Warhol. You know, we had heard about Andy Warhol, saw his superstars, saw his paintings, and just thought that New York was filled with that whole underground. There were clubs like the Mud Club, CBGBs, that you could go every night and see great bands and run into really interesting people.
Right.
But it was a much smaller time, smaller world then. It was like you knew the same 50, 75, 100 people. And you would know every night where everybody was. And it was all word of mouth. It was not, there was no internet. There was no somebody sending you a text. You know, there was like just who you would run into, and then they would say, oh, you know, I heard there's something really great going on at CBGB's tonight. So you'd walk over there, and then like maybe you missed it, and then you'd walk over someplace else. You know, it was just like a continual search every night for like what was going on. And
nothing cost all that much, right? I
no,
mean, you could,
no.
So somebody who was
even taxis didn't cost that much.
Right,
so
right. I mean, someone who was living a student life could feel that the whole city was open to her.
Yeah, I mean, well, we figured out how to get into clubs before you had to pay the cover. We'd get there before 9 o'clock and like try to hide in the bathroom so they wouldn't throw us out. And then we'd wait, and then all of a sudden, like, Jackie Onassis would walk in, and Valentino, and you know, it was like such an exciting time.
She was not hiding in the bathroom waiting to avoid the okay.
So, so you know, there was that mix back then too.
Yes.
And I'm not talking studio because I didn't really go to Studio 54, but there were other more underground clubs before that.
Right. Studio 54 was really the tip of that iceberg, but there was all this other stuff. Yeah. No, it's fascinating, that whole side of the 70s that when the city was this wonderful mix of culture and did not seem entirely driven by money.
Yes, definitely.
And not entirely defined by money.
And it was such a creative time, too. Because if you think about, like, the artists and musicians and people that came out of, like, let's say, the Mud Club scene.
Yes.
I mean, you have, you know, Jim Jarmusch, Debbie Harry, the Ramones, you know, Marianne Faithfull performed there. That's where I met Anita Pallenberg. Or you would see David Bowie there. You know, it was just like, it was a very creative mix of people.
Right, and if somebody worked for a financial institution, they'd be ashamed to admit it, probably in those days, as opposed to sort of feeling that they owned the world.
It was a different time.
It was a very different time in that way. Well, you know, like most successful careers, yours has been such a amazing combination of, I think, hard work, great talent, and also good fortune. We all see the great talent and the hard work. Could you say something about the role of fortune and luck in your career?
Definitely. You know, I think that you have to be in the right place at the right time.
Right.
And if it's not your moment, it's not your moment. And when I started my business in the 80s, I started around the same time as my friend Steven Sprouse, who saw incredible success right away. And I used to think, like, how come they like him better than me? You know, it's like, you know, I didn't get it. It was like, I mean, he did incredible stuff, but it was, you know, what's wrong? And then one day it just hit me. It's not your time yet. You have to be able to react to your time. And the moment that I realized it, you know, I was friends with Steven Meisel since school.
Right.
And he was, you know, he had made all these supermodels, Naomi, Linda, Christy. And I knew them socially. I didn't work with them. I knew them from dinners and parties and hanging out. And all of a sudden I noticed that what they were wearing changed. Like, they used to come head to toe Chanel, head to toe Versace to wherever we were. And all of a sudden Naomi came with like kind of a vintage top and jeans and some platform shoes, and there was a model making chokers. And I thought, things are changing. Like, maybe there's a chance for me. And I thought, like, maybe I could make a breakthrough. And what really gave me the confidence, I went to see the Paris shows for the first time with Steven. And the first show we were going to, we stopped and picked up Madonna at the Ritz. And when I walked in her room, she had racks of clothes and shopping bags from every designer in Paris. And I thought, oh my God, you know, everyone's just throwing things at her. And she came out of her dressing room with a coat on. We got in the car, got to the Gautier show, and when she took off her coat, she said, Anna, I have a surprise for you. And she was wearing my dress. And it was like, so that was one of the things that really gave me the confidence that maybe now was my time, that maybe now I could make that breakthrough. And when we got back to New York, Steven and my friend Paul Cavacco said, okay, you have to do a show. Now you have to do a show. And it was like, well, how am I going to do it? And they all said they would help me. And that's how I did my first show. Like, all my friends pitched in and helped.
Wow, that is a great story. That is the first story I've ever heard about Madonna in which she was not the main subject of the story. Actually, I love it for that reason alone. Let's turn to some of your questions. One of them is, how do you deal with work-life balance? Is work your life? Or?
You leave the balance part out.
Okay. Okay.
No, I mean, it's really, especially when you have your own company. I remember my dad said you had to be the first one in and the last one to leave every day. And it's kind of, I did that for many, many years. And you have to adapt to whatever needs to be done. Like, I knew how to do shipping. I knew how to fill out the UPS book. You know, like, those were things that had to get done. I think that I didn't really take a vacation till we went to Greece and Turkey. That was the first one. And I think I'd been in business more than 10 years at that point.
Wow.
So, you know, those are the things that, you know, you have to force yourself to do. But that's me. That's how I did it. I mean, other people have a different priority, but that's kind of how I did it.
And you've had no regrets about it?
I don't know. I mean, this is what I wanted. And I remember a fortune teller told me that this time around, it was going to work. This was going to be, I wouldn't have the obstacles. I mean, believe it or not, I don't know.
Well, but also, given who you are and your nature and the way you look at the world, it's not as though focusing on work meant locking yourself up in a room 24 hours a day either. I mean, you're engaged with the world. So that's a big part of having another life anyway, I think, is being engaged with the world. Yeah. What about one thing we have not talked about that I'd love to ask you a little bit about is that exhibition at the Museum of Art and Design, which is an unusual thing for a fashion designer and a wonderful coincidence with this moment. How did that come about? How engaged were you with the curators in pulling it together? What does it kind of stand for and show, would you say?
Well, the exhibit at the Museum of Arts and Design came about. I went to see an incredible show there called Counter Couture. And it was clothing, like hippie clothes that people had handmade, embroidered, tie-dyed. And I had seen pictures of those clothes either on like rock stars or there was an underground magazine that I used to get called Rags, and I would see some of those artisans. But I didn't really relate that I could actually see the clothes. I just remember seeing like black and white pictures and suddenly there was a whole 2 floors of all those clothes with the stories behind it and the influencers behind it. And it was such an amazing show. And I went back, I think, 4 times. And one of the times that I was there, I ran into Barbara Gifford, who curated this show. And she walked me through, so then I heard a lot of the backstory, too. And I had done the exhibit in London at the Fashion and Textile Museum, and I was trying to find a venue in New York. So then I approached them, and we started talking.
So the show was initially put together for London, then?
Yes, but it's a very different show. Although the clothing's the same, actually in New York we were able to use backdrops from my fashion shows,
Oh, okay.
which even gave it more kind of the atmosphere that we originally created.
Right, right.
And we changed the inspiration room where you first come out of the elevator, and we made it more New York, where there's Betsy Johnson, Norma Kamali, who were my two favorite designers when I went to Parsons. There's a Diana Vreeland doll that Greer Langton made, and that was mine, but I donated to the Metropolitan Museum. And she was kind of my idol, and I read Vogue magazine religiously when she was the editor-in-chief.
Third magazine we've heard mentioned tonight. Great, okay, good.
And then there's Jane Holzer, who I remember seeing in Life magazine in the Andy Warhol Superstar article. And she wore this outfit to the Muhammad Ali Joe Frazier fight when Muhammad Ali got his title back. But it's the most amazing George Kaplan fur coat with hot pants and knee-high boots. And then Zandra Rhodes, who just has always been such an incredible designer and a big inspiration. So it's a little different than what I had in London, where I had used all London designers.
Okay. But in each case, though, it's wonderful because you're really paying tribute to your mentors.
Yes.
And acknowledging them.
Which I think is important. I think that, especially I think for students to learn that I had dreams, I had aspirations, and I had idols, and that kind of inspired me.
And that, this did not spring full-blown from your forehead like Diana from Zeus. It's something,
And another thing that we really emphasize are all the people, like I've been fortunate to work with the same family of people. So for hair and makeup, I've always worked with Garen for hair, Francois Nars and Pat McGrath for makeup. Steven has helped me throughout. James Coviello's done all the sweaters and hats. Erickson Beeman has done all the jewelry for my shows. I mean, I have a whole team that's been so supportive. Oliphant did almost all the backdrops, and Jerry Schwartz did like the embroidery one in the back. And there's just a team of people that I rely on, and I think that that's been, such a great relationship.
That's
and
wonderful.
Again, people have to understand, even though there's one name on the label, there's a team. There's a lot of people behind it.
Right. Well, people behind it helping you now, but also the people who influenced you and inspired you, and you're acknowledging both of them, which is wonderful, actually. Yeah, which is fantastic. We have time for a couple more of these questions, and apologies in advance if we don't get to all of them, because there are so many. Here's an interesting one. What would be, if you were asked to sum up the 3 core values you have when it comes to your company? Could you say there are 3 core values?
That's hard. I think that it has to be true to my image, like true to the Anna Sui spirit, because I do a lot of licensed products too, and I put as much into like a tube of lipstick as I do to a runway outfit. And I think that customer, when they get that tube of lipstick, they have to have the same thrill and the same fantasy behind it that the garment does. Because maybe they don't have the lifestyle, they don't have the budget for the dress, but they can buy the lipstick for $28, and they feel they have something special. It's black packaging, carved roses, and then like interesting color inside, and it's scented like a rose scent.
Okay, so you refer to the Anna Sui spirit. What is that? If we asked you to sum up that in a few words, could you?
I think a lot of people say when they talk about my fashion that it's very feminine, but edgy. There's always a touch of rock and roll, but nostalgia. A little bit of flea market sort of thing, but always very recognizable. And I think that that's what helped build my brand. That when I opened my first store, we developed icons of the brand, the carved black roses, the black lacquer furniture, the purple walls, the red floors. All those things became so much a part of the code of my company for packaging, for logos, and we've used that all throughout all the licensing.
Great. Good, good. Here's an interesting one, particularly picking up in a way on some of the interesting comments you've made about the influence of print media years ago on you. What can today's journalists do better to preserve the legacy of designers and their brands in this fast fashion environment that we live in?
Well, I think that when there's not just the immediacy, when there's the backstory, when there's the history, when there's more about the evolution of the brand, I think that's interesting to me. Understanding how it happened, who worked with them along the way. I mean, like that's what makes a good like a book about a fashion designer, I think, when you learn all those things.
Right,
and then
right.
maybe you even discover other artisans that were involved that you can kind of go on to research too.
Should there be more fashion history taught, do you think?
Oh, definitely,
Yeah,
definitely, yeah. I think that, you know, I mean, I know as a kid, I knew who Jean Harlow was, but I didn't live in the 1930s.
Right, right,
You know,
right.
it's like I don't understand people that don't have a sense of history.
Right,
Yeah.
right. I mean, it should be part of education, right? Yeah,
Definitely, yeah.
Great, great. Here's a question that picks up on the exhibition, actually. In the exhibition, The World of Anna Sui, you mentioned several misconceptions about how to make it in the fashion industry as a young designer. What other misconceptions did you discover along the way, and what did you learn instead?
Well, I guess the biggest lesson is that it was always going to be the same, because it's never been the same. From like the moment that I did my first show and, you know, like New York was it, New York was happening, suddenly it shifts. Or the supermodels were happening, but suddenly there's the waifs, and then there's the Belgians, and then there's the Russian girls. You know, it just, everything changes. And I think that that's the thing that you have to realize, is that everything's only for that moment. And you have to be able to react to the next moment.
Right, right, right. We've talked earlier about the sort of the movement of manufacturing away from New York. What does New York mean today in fashion as a creative center, as a design center, do you think?
Well, I think that there's still a focus here. I
Right.
think that there still is New York Fashion Week. There's a lot of talented people, and there's a lot of new emerging designers. And I think that seems to be a focal point right now, is that I know like the Cfda is trying to be very supportive of the emerging designers. I think, you know, I think that in other places like London, there was a huge support for emerging designers. So I think that that's something that could have more attention and more
could we
focus.
be a better incubator, let's say, of talent in New York?
Yeah, but it's just, I think it's been hard to catch up, because it's changed so quickly as
Right.
far as where they're able to have studios, where they're able to manufacture, where they're able to get their materials. It's changed so quickly that it's kind of, everyone's catching up a little bit right now.
Right. There are several questions that touch in one way or another on issues of sustainability. And one questioner, who's a fashion marketing student, points out that the fashion industry contributes to about 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions and 20% of global wastewater today. What sustainability initiatives do you take within the company, and what's your sense of the responsibility of the fashion industry in this area?
I think that there's a lot of discussion about that and what works and what doesn't work. I don't think that the final word has come out yet, and I don't know why this person is going into fashion. You know, go into sustainability, like if that's such an important
If that's their
cause.
priority, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, because when you're creating clothes, you're creating new clothes.
Right,
you
right,
have
right,
to,
right, right.
you know, and you know, there's a lot of like repurposing, but you can only do that for so long because you run out of the materials that, you know, you can have leftovers, some kind of fabric or tablecloths or, you know, but it's hard to continue, especially as your business grows.
Right.
So
right,
you
right,
need
right.
you need kind of to have that support of your resources again.
Right. I mean,
So-
you exist to create the new,
Yeah.
which by definition is at least somewhat inconsistent with sustainability on some
Right.
level. Right. Right. And so one has to accept that, even while presumably you do all the reasonable things in your
Right.
office about, you know, maintaining is some degree of responsibility with energy and all that, which everybody does today, I think. Yeah, right. Where is the majority of your manufacturing done?
New York.
Quite interesting.
New York.
You still do most of it in New York?
Yes, as much as we can. Yeah.
Okay.
I'd say 85, 90%.
Wow. And does that, how unusual is that among high-profile
Yeah, it's not
major
the
fashion-
smartest way to go. I
Right,
mean,
right.
Or the cheapest, you know,
Right,
but
right,
it's
right.
the way I wanted to do it. And I always wanted to support the industry here.
Right.
And it's just the way I set up my business. You know, I
That's-
wanted to
yeah.
keep as much as I could here.
That's incredible. I feel like, to use an old journalism phrase, we've buried the lead here. I mean, that's actually one of the most important things you could possibly have said tonight, actually. And here it is.
Thank you.
It's kind of slipped in almost sideways toward the end of our conversation. Is it significantly more expensive? What are the side benefits besides just feeling good about supporting your city?
You know, I mean, this is how I learned how to do clothes. I have a design studio where we make the first pattern, we drape it, we cut the first samples, sew them, and then after we sell them, we make them with contractors within the neighborhood. This way, I feel we can control the quality and, you know, work closely with the contractor. I know that now most people do a tech pack and that you put numbers on a piece of paper and send it somewhere. And usually it has to go back and forth quite a few times in order to get the perfect garment. So talk about sustainability and, you know, it's like, I think I cut a lot of steps out of there, the back and forth, you know. So you know, it's something that I feel that I can control better. And I don't have clothes that we sell 1,000 pieces of a style.
You're not really doing mass market
Exactly,
stuff. Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
So this is kind of the old-fashioned way.
And you're reducing your carbon footprint by not getting on a plane to Hong Kong all the time, too, or Vietnam,
4 or
what
5
have you.
times, right? You know, it's just like...
Yeah. And I think, and you also do not have the issues that concern a lot of people in terms of protection for workers. You're not vulnerable to that issue if it's being done here. But have you tried to be a public advocate for more work being done in New York?
Yeah.
Great.
I mean, it's a uphill fight because, you know, I think the landlords really have control of the situation. But I think we made some strides in delaying the demise of the garment center.
I think this is, I mean, it must feel sometimes like you're pushing a boulder uphill a little bit. But
but then something will happen, like the economy will work in our favor, or suddenly there's a new initiative where we get some people behind it, some politicians behind it.
I mean, it makes me want to run out and buy something just to support this. Actually, I think it's fantastic. There are so many questions, and we're now just about the end of our time. So I wish we could prolong it. We can't for more than a moment or two. But let me go to just one or two more quickly, because they are so good. What is the thing that you feel disappointed about in the modern fashion industry?
I don't know if it's my place to be disappointed.
Okay.
You know, I think I'm really fortunate that I'm doing what I love and that I've been able to do it for so long. you know, it's like I don't have a complaint about that.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah,
And,
it's not my place to complain about
right,
it.
and
Yeah.
other people's issues are their problem, not your, in a way. But I mean, in terms of the larger, the ecosystem of the fashion industry in a bigger way, I guess. That's what the question was getting at, I think.
Yeah, I mean, do I wish it was like how it was in 2008? Yes.
Right.
Who doesn't? You know, so it's
Sure.
just, but that's, you know, again, I'm still fortunate that I'm doing what I do.
Well, it seems to me you have a wonderful instinctive balance between holding on to fantasies and dreams, but also being grounded in reality.
I think you need that.
Right. And you need the balance between the two,
Yeah.
I think, to make it work. Here's a wonderful question that happens to be at the end of this list, but it's a perfect way to conclude, which is, what is the most important thing you got from your experience at Parsons?
My best friend, Steven Meisel.
Ah, okay. Okay, that's very nice. That's wonderful. Okay. And that's a great answer and a wonderful conclusion to a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you. Thank you. That's great. Thank you. Thank you.